July is when most rose growers stop paying attention. The spring flush is over, the bushes look a little rough, and the instinct is to coast until fall. That instinct is exactly what costs you next year's best blooms. Here's the truth nobody tells you at the garden center. July isn't a rest month for roses. It's a decision month. Every choice you make in the next few weeks, water, feeding, pruning, disease control, gets locked in as either a stronger fall bloom cycle or a bush that limps into September half its potential size. And one of the three mistakes I'm about to cover is something almost every rose grower has done at least once, thinking it was helping. Today I'm walking you through the 9 things your roses actually need this month, and the 3 moves that quietly undo all of it. Before we start, drop your state or your USDA zone in the comments. Roses in Zone 5 Minnesota and roses in Zone 9 Georgia are dealing with completely different Julys, and I read every comment to figure out what to cover next. Let's get into it. Number 1. Don't quit on deep watering, even if it rained this week. There's a common assumption that a single storm resets the clock on watering. It doesn't. Roses are deep-rooted shrubs, and a 20-minute downpour typically wets only the top inch or 2 of soil before running off. Meanwhile, the roots that actually matter, 6 to 12 inches down, never see a drop. Roses need roughly 1.5 to 2 inches of water per week during July heat, delivered in 1 or 2 long, slow soakings rather than daily light watering. Shallow, frequent watering trains roots to stay near the surface, which is exactly where they're most exposed to heat stress and where they'll suffer first when a real dry spell hits. Push a finger 3 to 4 inches into the soil near the base. If it's dry there, the surface looking damp means nothing. A soaker hose or drip line left running for 45 minutes to an hour is the best delivery method, since it puts water at the root zone without ever wetting the foliage. Overhead sprinklers waste water to evaporation and leave leaves wet overnight, which sets up the disease problem we'll cover in a few minutes. Water in the morning, before 10 a.m., so anything that does splash on the leaves dries before evening. Container roses and anything planted against a south-facing wall needs special attention here, since both dry out far faster than an in-ground bed. A rose in a pot can go from adequately moist to bone dry in a single hot afternoon, so check containers by hand daily rather than trusting your in-ground schedule to cover them too. And if you're relying on rain gauges, place one directly under the plant's canopy, not out in the open lawn, since a dense rose canopy can shed a surprising amount of rainfall away from its own root zone. Number 2, feed for the fall flush, not just for foliage. Most rose feeding advice stops after spring, which leaves gardeners guessing in July. Here's what's actually happening. Roses that get proper nutrition through midsummer set up a genuinely strong second bloom cycle in September and October, often rivaling the spring show. Skip feeding now, and that fall flush comes in thin, pale, and small. Use a balanced rose fertilizer or one slightly higher in phosphorus and potassium relative to nitrogen. Too much nitrogen this time of year pushes soft leafy growth at the expense of buds, and that soft growth is also the first thing pests target. Apply at the rate on the label, water it in well, and stop feeding by mid to late August in most zones so the plant has time to harden off before cooler weather. A 1-inch layer of compost worked lightly into the soil around each bush is a gentler, slower release option that does a lot of this work without any risk of overfeeding. Repeat bloomers like hybrid teas, floribundas, and modern shrub roses respond most dramatically to this midsummer feeding, since they're actively cycling toward another round of buds all season long. Once blooming old garden roses, and most climbers that flower primarily in spring don't need this feeding push nearly as much, since they're not building toward a fall show the same way. Know which category your rose falls into before you decide how much effort to put into the step, since feeding a once bloomer for a fall flush it was never going to produce is wasted product and wasted money. Number 3, deadhead correctly, not just for looks. Here's the mistake almost every rose grower makes without realizing it. Snipping the spent bloom off at the very top of the stem cleans up the look, but it barely changes the plant's energy allocation. The rose is still routing resources toward that stem trying to finish setting seed in the hip. Follow the finished bloom stem down to the first 5-leaflet leaf, not a 3-leaflet leaflet closer to the flower, and cut there, at an angle, just above that leaf. That's the growth point strong enough to push a healthy new stem and bud. Cutting too high, right above a weak 3-leaflet leaf, gets you a thin, floppy replacement stem that often can't support the next bloom. This one change in cut location is the difference between a rebloom that's just as strong as the first flush and one that's noticeably weaker. Make the cut at roughly a 45-degree angle, sloping away from the bud, so water sheds off the cut surface instead of sitting on it and inviting rot. And clean your pruners between bushes, especially if you have any plant showing disease symptoms, since a dirty blade is one of the easiest ways fungal problems travel from one rose to the next in a home garden. One exception: if you're growing a rose variety valued for its hips, rugosas, some old garden roses, stop deadheading by late summer and let some blooms go to hip. That's a deliberate trade, not neglect, and those hips often feed birds well into winter. Number 4. Put the pruners down everywhere else. This is one of the 3 mistakes I mentioned at the top, and it's the one that feels the most like responsible upkeep. A rose bush looks a little wild in July, and the instinct is to give it a hard shaping cut to tidy it up. Don't. Hard structural pruning in the heat of summer forces the plant into fresh, tender growth at exactly the moment it's least able to protect that growth from sun scald and heat stress. That new growth is also weak and disease-prone, since it hasn't had time to develop the sturdier tissue that spring growth had. The result is a bush that looks worse by August, not better. Light, selective removal is fine. Dead canes, crossing branches, or spent blooms as covered above. If a cane is clearly dead, brown and brittle with no green tissue underneath when scratched, remove it any time. Everything else waits. Save the real shaping pruning for late winter dormancy, which is when it actually helps the plant instead of stressing it. If your bush genuinely looks unruly and you have an event coming up, remove only the 2 or 3 most awkward canes rather than reshaping the whole plant. That's a haircut, not a renovation, and it won't cost you next year's structure. Number 5. Get ahead of black spot and powdery mildew before they explode. July's heat and humidity are exactly the conditions both diseases thrive in, and by the time you notice heavy symptoms, you're not curing anything. You're just slowing the spread for the rest of the season. Black spot shows up as circular black or brown spots on lower leaves with yellowing around the edges, usually working upward. Powdery mildew looks like a dusty gray-white coating, often on new growth and buds first, and tends to show up worse when days are humid and nights are cool. Both spread fastest through wet foliage, which is exactly why base watering matters so much. Strip any visibly infected leaves immediately and get them in the trash, never the compost pile, since both pathogens can survive there and spread right back into your beds. A weekly preventative spray, whether a fungicide labeled for roses or a diluted baking soda and horticultural oil mix, applied to clean, dry foliage in the morning is far more effective as prevention than as a cure. Improve airflow by thinning any densely packed interior growth, since stagnant, humid air inside the bush is what lets both diseases take hold in the first place. If you're replacing a rose that struggled with black spot for multiple seasons running, look for varieties bred with strong disease resistance rather than fighting the same battle every summer. Some modern shrub rose lines were developed specifically to shrug off black spot pressure that would defoliate an older hybrid tea by August. Number 6. Scout for Japanese beetles and aphids while the population is still small. July is peak season for Japanese beetles across most of the eastern half of the country, and they go straight for rose blooms and buds. A handful of beetles today can multiply into a serious infestation within 2 weeks in warm conditions. Hand-picking beetles into a jar of soapy water in the early morning while they're sluggish from cooler overnight temperatures works better than most sprays and doesn't harm pollinators visiting the same blooms. Skip beetle bag traps entirely. Research consistently shows they draw more beetles into your yard than they actually catch, often from neighboring properties. Aphids cluster on new buds and the undersides of leaves, and a strong blast of water from the hose knocks most colonies back without any spray at all. For a heavier infestation, insecticidal soap applied directly to the aphids does the job without disrupting the rest of your garden's insect life. Check plants every few days this month, since this is the fastest-moving pest window of the whole season. Ladybugs and lacewings are genuine allies against aphids, so if you see either one patrolling your rose bed, hold off on spraying that plant and let the predator do the work for free. Number 7. Mulch properly, and don't let it touch the crown. A 3-inch layer of mulch around each rose bush cuts moisture evaporation dramatically and keeps soil temperature more stable through the hottest stretch of the year, which directly supports the deep watering you're already doing. But mulch pulled up against the base of the plant, touching the canes, holds moisture right where you don't want it, and invites both fungal problems and pest activity at the crown. Keep a 2 to 3 inch gap of bare soil between the mulch ring and the base of the bush. Shredded bark, pine straw, or aged compost all work well, and each has a slightly different upside. Pine straw breaks down slowly and suits acid-loving roses, while compost feeds the soil as it decomposes. If you already have mulch piled against your roses from earlier in the season, pull it back now. This is a 5-minute fix per bush with an outsized return, and it's one of the most commonly overlooked details in home rose care. Number 8. Stake or support anything that started leaning under bloom weight. Climbing roses and larger shrub varieties often start sagging under the weight of July's growth and blooms, especially after a heavy rain. A cane that stays bent for a few weeks develops a permanent kink, and a cane that snaps at the base is gone for the season. This is an easy thing to overlook because it happens gradually, one slightly heavier bloom flush at a time. A simple stake and soft tie, or training onto an existing trellis or arbor, prevents both problems. Use a wide, soft material like cloth strips or purpose-made plant ties rather than wire or twine, which can cut into a cane as it thickens. Check ties on climbers specifically, since canes thicken through the season, and a tie that was fine in May can girdle a cane by August if it isn't loosened. This takes minutes and prevents damage that otherwise takes a full year to grow back. Number 9. Plan now for the fall flush you're setting up. Everything you do in July, the watering, the feeding, the deadheading, the disease prevention, is building toward the second bloom cycle most rose growers don't even expect. Roses that are well cared for through midsummer heat routinely put on a fall flush in September and October that's just as strong as spring, sometimes with richer, more saturated color thanks to cooler night temperatures slowing down bloom fade. Mark your calendar for one final light feeding in early to mid-August, depending on your zone, so the plant has nutrients available heading into that fall bloom without pushing tender growth too close to your first frost date. If you're in zones 8 or 9, you have more runway and can feed slightly later into August. If you're in zone 5 or 6, don't push feeding past mid-August, since new growth needs time to harden off before the first cold snap. This is the payoff step for everything else on this list, and it's the one most gardeners forget because by August, they've already mentally checked out for the season, right when the plant needs one more push. Now, the 3 mistakes that undo all of it. Mistake 1. Watering shallow and often instead of deep and infrequent. It feels responsible because you're out there every day, but it trains roots to stay near the surface, exactly where they're most vulnerable to heat and drought. Mistake 2. Hard pruning in summer heat. It feels like tidying up, but it forces vulnerable new growth at the worst possible time and sets the plant back rather than improving it. Mistake 3. Deadheading at the top of the stem instead of down at the first 5-leaflet leaf. It looks the same in the moment, but it's the difference between a strong red bloom and a weak, floppy one. Here's your complete July rose checklist. Deep water once or twice a week at the base, never overhead. Feed for the fall flush with balanced or phosphorus-leaning fertilizer, and stop by mid to late August. Deadhead down to the first 5-leaflet leaf, not the top of the stem. Skip hard structural pruning until winter dormancy. Watch for black spot and powdery mildew and treat preventatively on dry mornings. Handpick Japanese beetles early, while the population is small. Keep mulch at 3 inches deep with a gap at the crown. Stake or support anything leaning under bloom weight. And remember that everything you do this month is setting up your fall bloom cycle, not just getting you through summer. If you're in a hot, humid zone, disease pressure is your biggest risk this month. Stay ahead of it. If you're in a drier or cooler zone, watering consistency is what will make or break your fall flush. Same plant, same principles, different priority depending on where you garden, which is exactly why I keep asking for your zone. July looks like a quiet month for roses. It's actually the month that decides whether your fall blooms show up strong or barely show up at all. Drop your zone and the one rose problem you're dealing with right now in the comments. I read every single one, and it shapes what this channel covers next.